Hey everyone. Every week you're going to see me do a brief lecture or two on whatever concept we're working on. This week, very first week, the very first thing I teach in a lot of my creative writing classes is about details. In fact, even when I teach composition classes, I often start with details just because they're the really the most important parts of the sentences. What are you conveying to the reader? I'm outside right now in my backyard, and so if the dogs bark or something like that, I apologize. It just was more quiet out here than it was inside my house. So, anyways, we're going to start with the necessary detail. Um, you as a writer have a relationship with the reader, and this relationship is really important because you have to establish trust with the reader. You want the reader to be able to trust that you are not only going to tell them a story, you're going to keep them excited, you're not going to disappoint them, but that you're going to world build for them. And what I mean by world build is you are creating that sort of movie set, or in this case, the story set in their mind, for them to see the world, to experience the world that you're trying to immerse them in. So it's a really fragile relationship, and we have to be, as writers, we have to be really aware of that relationship. And I think most of what we do as fiction writers is think about our readers. What do they need in order to get them to see what we're seeing? Picture of a heart. Okay, cool. Let's go to the next screen here. Believability. So, this is something that comes from your textbooks, but I really like this quote. Liars, cheaters, and con artists, the good ones anyway, know the value of a well-chosen detail. So do fiction writers. And this is 100% true. Fiction writers have to understand what the well-chosen detail is. You don't have a lot of room in fiction, especially in short fiction, so you really have to be concise, and you have to select things. Yeah, you can spend pages and pages and pages describing, some glorious setting, but in short story, you actually really don't have that much time and space, and so you really have to choose details based on what your purpose is for the reader. Next screen. So one thing that I would suggest is to give your reader the raw data and not the linguistic blueprint. So you don't have to give a reader all the specifics of a library in order to get them to see a general library. What you do is you give them sort of the raw data. And so I have here something that comes from another textbook: the air tinged with the scent of old pages, the shafts of dusty light diffused through window slats, the whispers like trickling water of librarians behind the oval reference desk. And through those well-selected details, we can start to see what the library starts to look like, right? So again, it's thinking about like, what does the reader need in order to see the rest of the world? Do you have to describe them every level of the library? No. Unless that's something that later becomes important, or the levels change, or based on the reader's need at that point in the story. So in order to really give those vivid details, you really have to use concrete details. And so you're going to hear me harp on this a lot, especially this week, especially with your upcoming exercise. I'm really looking for you to do 4 of those 5 um, um, concrete details, sensory details in your exercise. If you can, use all 5. But sometimes, just depending on what we're talking about, we can't always use taste, especially if you're describing a person. It'd be kind of a weird thing to describe a taste to them. So again, we want to create that raw data, and we want it to seem super natural in a storyline. So it's not description that sort of interrupts the story flow, it's description that goes along with the story. So the story is building in sight, in smell, in sound, all of those ways as the plot itself is unfolding. So you can't see the forest for the trees. That's a phrase that you've probably heard before, but it's one I think worth noting in fiction, because if you pay too much attention to the forest, you're going to miss sort of the trees. And so in riveting fiction, right, you really want to concentrate like on a tree, or a group of trees, or maybe the smell of trees or the sound of the trees, in order to sort of get a sense of the forest. So we kind of zoom in so that the reader can then create all the things that they need to in order to zoom out and around. So your writing must paint a picture with words, which means you have to give us enough of those concrete details for us, the reader, to experience it. We want to be able to see it, whatever it is that you want us to see. We want to be able to smell whatever it is you want us to smell, hear, right, so on and so forth. So it's really, really up to you to show. Again, you'll hear me say this a lot this week, especially like in my feedback to you about your exercises, showing versus telling. Right? I often think of the difference between the two of them as telling becomes this list of things, right? The driver's license details, for instance. You can get your driver's license or your ID card out, and it might give your height and the color of your eyes and the, color of your hair and whether or not you're an organ donor, but that doesn't really tell us a lot about you. Could we pick you out, out on the campus of Chaffey? Probably not. So be careful of giving those telling details that are too specific and yet too general at the same time. You really, as a fiction writer, want to zoom in on people. So, and again, you want to stay away from cliche too. So if you're going to concentrate on a character's eyes, make sure those eyes are something we haven't seen before. Don't describe steely, ooh, bug on the face, steely blue eyes. Don't give us descriptions we've sort of seen before. Give us something we haven't seen before that shows something about your character. If your character is very shy and maybe introverted, maybe they don't smile in a way that shows their teeth, right? Or perhaps, your character has something, very physically different about them. In a way that gives us a sense of, maybe how they perceive the world or how the world perceives them. So again, be very specific and let your characters be unique. See them, hear them, listen to them in your head. All right. So 2 levels here. We always want to make sure that whatever imagery we select, whatever details, that there's double meanings to them in some ways. Now we don't want to overly work in, symbol in a way that seems cumbersome or it trips up a reader, but we do want to think about those things. So for instance, if it's important to know that a character is driving a certain, car, is it actually important that we know the make and model of that car? Maybe it is. Again, it just kind of depends on plot. But maybe it's more important that the character has, a pearl white car or something like that. Maybe that becomes something significant that we learn later. So again, we're thinking about detail, we're thinking about symbol, we're thinking about all of those things as we craft this. Now, let me just kind of add a caveat there. When you are doing your free writing in your journal, don't allow the idea of detail working on multiple levels to interrupt your flow of creativity. The way I personally approach a journal is really to sit down and just write for a chunk of time, whatever time I set myself, 10, 15 minutes, sometimes 20 minutes, and just let the ideas flow. It's really in the editing process where you can pare back those details and decide what's important, what's not important, what you can work in or change or edit in order to give it some other sort of meaning. So don't feel like you have to get that right. I'm still working on stories that are years old, and I still find ways to go back and say like, oh, that detail could be flipped into something else, which would give a new level of meaning there. So, all right. So your job as a writer is really to capture interesting characters, characters who are strange and unique and newsworthy and perhaps, and it doesn't always have to be strange people. Maybe these are ordinary people whose stories don't get told a lot or at all. Maybe they're necessary stories too. There's a lot of marginalized groups in the world who've yet to tell stories and tell stories about their lives or their experiences. And maybe perhaps you have a story within you to tell from a character perspective that hasn't been told before. So that is your job. And if you're keeping all of those things in mind, if you are in fact telling a story that has never been told before, you really want to approach it from that idea that no character, just like no human on earth, could tell the same story in the same way. That's what makes writing so compelling for me personally, but also just as an art form. No two people are ever going to have the same experiences, have the same history, have the same, you know, life in order to draw from those experiences to tell a story in the same kind of way, even if it's the same story. So I would really challenge you this week as you're working on details. You know, you may just start with a particular detail, but really to think about the character as a whole. Depending on what kind of journal interests you, you may start with an object and decide that that object then is sort of representative of a character. And so as you work through that and write the journal for that, think about who that character is and what story perhaps is in them, and what is interesting to know, or you know, what is why are they story worthy, or perhaps whatever happens to them is story worthy. But here's something that I often say when it comes to short story, and again, these are things I'll probably say to you multiple times, so that's okay. Just pretend I haven't said it to you before. But stories are about people. They always are about people. You might say to yourself, yes, but story is about plot, but and that's true, but plot is actually about character. And so everything in my fiction courses always go back to character, and character is really going to be built on these necessary and relevant details. So be sure that you really unpack the first and second chapter of our textbook to get Cardos's understanding of this. I think he does a really nice job of telling us what is necessary. This week as you read A and P, think about all of those details that he uses to describe the three girls in the store, and Sammy himself, and the other checkers slash manager too. You know, there are certain details that stand out for certain characters, and again, you have to ask yourself, well, why? Why those selected details? And as you unpack them, it really starts to reveal something very, very specific. So for instance, I haven't even read this story in several months, but I know off the top of my head, and perhaps it's because I've read the story 100 times, but the way Sammy describes Queenie, the girl he sort of fantasized after the most, at one point when she pulls out a crumpled dollar bill from her bathing suit top, he describes that the top of her breast as sort of the finest 2 scoops of vanilla. And you can see right there, just the way he's describing that, right, is this overly sexual description, which, even if that makes you cringe as a feminist, right, or as a reader, or if it, you know, excites you or what have you, it tells you something really specific about Sammy, and what he's thinking at that moment as he's watching this dollar bill come out of this bathing suit top. So really pay attention to A&P. Raymond Carver John Updike is so good at working on such a base level of detail. And in fact, I feel like the whole story kind of hinges on the detail too of what the girls actually purchase in the store. So really pay attention for that, and ask yourself, like, what is that, and what does that say about the girls, and how is that in contrast perhaps to who Sammy is. I'll be seeing you guys on the discussion board. If you do have questions, of course, reach out to me, and yeah, see you soon.